People tell me that the Granville-Sharp rule has been completely debunked. Other people tell me that John 1 verse 1, the third verse or the third clause in that verse, has been completely, argued by scholars to be referring to Jesus, and the word was a God. And so what I did is I went and found where these scholars were who were saying these things, and it turns out there's one guy. A guy by the surname of BeDuhn, who has written a book called The Truth in Translation. And in this video, we're going to take a look at some of the core arguments there and examine, are these things actually debunked? Have scholars overturned modern translations and translations for hundreds of years in these passages? And so let's take a look at that. Truth in Translation is really written to try and give somebody who uses English some sort of certainty about how they should think about things like accuracy and reliability in Bible translations. And the first 3 chapters of the book really just deal with what is how does translation work, what is accuracy, what are the major translations that he's talking about in this book. And that's actually an important point because this book was written in 2003, which was it was published in 2003, which is just after the English Standard Version was published. It's nearly 20-something years old. It's over 20-something years old now. So it's not a new book. And it's funny how these things take time to sort of circulate into the mainstream. But as a book published in 2003, it's kind of a product of its time in many ways. In fact, it's actually a product well before its time in the sense that, as a rule, BeDuhn's arguments rely on grammars, Greek grammars, that really are primarily from the middle of the 20th century. And he takes a look at Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, at least an early-ish version of that as well. So there are some real issues with where he's getting his information from, and there are grammars that are starting to become available, and there's a lot of works that's been done before he publishes this that he doesn't refer to at all. And I think this is actually one of the biggest flaws with this book, is he's really just not even looking at modern Greek discussion points as he begins the argument in his book. And I'm not going to deal with all of that in detail. All that just to say that he's working from some older assumptions, and he brings those assumptions into his argument. And you'll see as I talk through this that actually becomes a major flaw, if you like, in the way he treats the language as a whole. The first of the big arguments that I really want to look at is from chapter 4. And this is where he deals with the Greek word proskuneo, which is the word that is often translated in modern translations as to worship. And he makes a really interesting point here and argues that we need to be more nuanced in the way we translate this word. He argues that to translate proskuneo as to worship actually is unfaithful in many cases. For instance, in Matthew chapter 2, he makes the argument that the Magi, when they come to King Herod and they say, "We have come to worship him," he makes the argument that actually it's probably not worship that they're intending to say they're coming to do, but to honor him. And they make a really good point at that point. Why, after all, would you bow down and worship a baby? It kind of doesn't make sense, particularly given their lack of knowledge, being outsiders. They're not Israelites, they're not expecting a child or anything like that as far as we know. And so why would they come and worship? But yet we can understand that he's been born a king. They get that, and therefore the appropriate response would be to honor him. And that would be what the Greek word proskuneo actually means. And therefore the translation in this text could actually be better rendered as "we have come to honor him." And this isn't the only place he makes this argument. He makes it in a number of other locations as well, even talking about Jesus, where people aren't necessarily coming to Jesus to worship him, even though the translations often say that. They're just really honoring him as a man who's highly esteemed within the culture in which he's found. And so this makes a really interesting point. And I think there are times where we should be careful about the way we translate proskuneo and not always translate it as to worship, but instead to honor or to bow down before, even just providing that physical element to the word. And so I think we can do a better job of translating this not more consistently, but perhaps less consistently in English, but more consistently with the meaning of the Greek word that sits in behind the translations. All good so far, but the problem here is that he then defends the argument that did obeisance, or to do obeisance, is a better translation. Which is really to say, on the one hand, we need to be more nuanced about the way we translate this word, but then on the other hand, to say obeisance is always better than worship. And my argument would be no. If you're applying this argument to the word worship, you should probably apply the same argument to the word obeisance as well. Besides which, the word obeisance is not even a word we use in modern English at all, anywhere. I don't think I've ever used that word anywhere, at any time, for any purpose. And so why would I use it in a Bible translation at all? It doesn't make any sense. It's just, a translation by obscurity to try and obscure what the word really means. So I would argue here that his argument that proskuneo, yes, we should be more careful about translating this, but I would argue against translating it as obeisance, not merely because it is just a different word than worship and it's just applied consistently, but also because it's actually just a bad word to use because nobody uses this in modern English. And therefore, while I agree with his overall argument in chapter 4, I would argue against his conclusion that obeisance is a better word to use. And therefore, I would argue against his use of the word in the New World Translation and his argument that the New World Translation is therefore a more faithful witness or a more faithful English translation. So that's the first chapter, well, the first chapter with any substance to it anyway, chapter 4, where he's arguing for proskuneo. There are a number of other chapters in this book which are worth considering, but I'm not going to consider in this for the sake of time. For instance, he talks about Colossians chapter 2, which I've dealt with elsewhere, and you can find a video on that up here. He talks about male bias. I've talked about gender bias, although in this case I think he's really making poor arguments around the use of the demonstrative. And he also talks about Christ in Philippians 2, where he's arguing that it doesn't mean that Jesus was rightfully God. And so I'm not going to deal with those arguments, but what I will do is skip over to chapter 8, where he talks about the Granville Sharp rule, because this is one that we've had on this channel a few times, and I often get people commenting on those videos to saying the Granville Sharp rule has been debunked, and they're actually referencing this book and this chapter when they do so. So let's take a look at BeDuhn's argument that the Granville Sharp rule should be debunked. Now, as we look at this chapter, he begins the chapter by arguing that Granville Sharp was actually theologically motivated. He doesn't take into account that we now have 1700 years of theological discussion and, solidification around the deity of Christ. And so therefore to call Granville Sharp biased when he's got literally centuries of theological history behind him seems to me to be a little bit like the pot calling the kettle black. But nonetheless, we'll move on from that. He also goes in then and looks at Wallace's argument that the Sharp rule doesn't apply to plurals, and then he says, well, because the Sharp rule doesn't apply to plurals, therefore it actually has no evidence at all. And I don't think that's what Wallace is arguing. In fact, Wallace does a really good job of explaining what the Granville Sharp rule does do, how it does hold water, and how it really doesn't in other cases. So I think he's really not doing a lot of justice to what Dan Wallace has actually said in his own grammar as he's talked about this as well. But he uses this one argument to sort of try and say, well, there is no evidence for the Granville Sharp rule. And he's only just asserting that. He's not going back to look at all those examples of the Granville Sharp rule, which I've talked about on this channel before. Again, you can, another video up here if you want to find those, where there's loads of examples where the Granville Sharp rule holds up under scrutiny, and you can find that in that video up here. But he doesn't go through all of those. In fact, he doesn't go through any of those to look at them and debunk them, which is what he really needs to do. Instead, what he does is he looks at Smith, which is again quite an old grammar now, and he looks at things like a hendiadys. He doesn't call it that, but a hendiadys is where you've got two words that stand together for one kind of thing. In this case, commanders and captains, which stands for, commanding officials. And then he uses another example, which is kind of a merism, where you've got the small and the big boats to talk about a fleet. That's a merism, where you've got all the different kinds of boats together, which is a fleet. That's a merism, and it's like saying, in season and out of season. It's like always, right? Or day and night, to tell you how, about a day or the parts of a day, to discuss the day as a whole. And so he's taking these ideas, these word pictures, if you like, and then he's confusing them with what he thinks the Granville Sharp rule might actually be portraying. But he hasn't looked at any of these texts in the New Testament that argue for the Granville Sharp rule. All he's looking at is the passage in 2 Peter and in Titus 3 verse 8. And that's it. He's just trying to debunk those two passages. Another argument he makes in this chapter, which we will come back to in a moment, is that the term theos is a proper name in the New Testament. In fact, he argues later on that there are two uses of the word theos. One is as a proper name and one is as just a noun. And he says this later, when the article comes before theos, then it's always being used as a proper name, and when it doesn't, it's being used as a noun. I don't agree with that, and he actually doesn't provide any support for this. He doesn't go through any text to show that this is the case. He just simply asserts it and then assumes that you're going to believe him and then move on with this. And I don't believe him. I think he's wrong on this. But then he uses that to build his argument, because what he's saying now is that the Granville-Sharp rule doesn't apply to proper nouns, and therefore, since God is a proper noun, it doesn't apply in that passage in 2 Peter chapter 1 or in Titus 3 verse 8, and therefore the rule doesn't apply. So in short, he really doesn't, if this is his best way of debunking the Granville-Sharp rule, it's a pretty poor attempt. He hasn't looked at any of the examples in the New Testament where the Granville-Sharp rule does stand up. He hasn't offered any alternative explanations for those other passages to say that therefore this must be such and such else instead of the Granville-Sharp rule. And therefore, if the Granville-Sharp rule holds up in those other places, it can hold up in these other two places where the deity of Christ is in question. And when he does look at those two passages that argue for the deity of Christ, his core argument is that theos is a proper noun, and therefore the Granville-Sharp rule doesn't count. He doesn't provide any argumentation to show that theos is being used as a proper noun. He just makes this as an assertion. And so I disagree with him here, and I would say anything but the Granville-Sharp rule has been debunked. This is not a good example to turn to say, see, the Granville-Sharp rule has been debunked, because it frankly just doesn't do that. He's trying to, but he fails miserably. And that brings us really to the last argument of the book, chapter 11, which is the one I'm going to deal with now. And in this one, he's really dealing with John chapter 1, verse 1. And here there are a number of things that I would take issue with in his argumentation. The first one, again, like I mentioned right at the beginning, is he's using mid-20th century grammars. And mid-20th century grammars all pretty much uniformly talk about at least the ones he's using, talk about the article as being definite and the lack of article being indefinite. And he's basically arguing that the article in Greek is the same as the definite article in English. And this plagues his work generally, but it's a big problem in John 1 verse 1. Now, modern grammars dating from Porter and Carson in the 90s prior to this book all will argue that the lack of article can sometimes be indefinite, sure, but not always, and more often it's qualitative. And there are arguments we'll probably not get into today that talk about that in this passage. But nonetheless, the argument that the article is definite and the lack of article is indefinite is deeply flawed and completely out of date, even by the time this book was written. But he takes this argumentation and he argues that whenever you see the article before theos, it makes it definite. And this just doesn't stand up in its own right. I mean, we have passages like Matthew 19 verse 26. If you're going to be consistent in this, so to say that the article before theos makes it definite and the lack of article before theos makes it indefinite, then you're going to end up with passages like Matthew 19:26, but with a God, all things are possible, because you don't have an article before theos in that verse. Or in Matthew chapter 27 verse 43, Jesus' enemies are saying that Jesus said, I am the son of a God. Well, the problem with that is now, which God are we talking about? And you end up with this deeply flawed polytheistic worldview that just doesn't work in the biblical context. So I don't think he's got any reasoning to stand on that's reasonable here at all. Another one, Jesus himself says, have faith in a God. If the word theos is indefinite, then in Mark 11:22, where you don't have the article prior to theos, then Jesus is saying, have faith in a God, not have faith in God, but in a God. Well, Jesus is not going to be endorsing polytheism, is he? He's not saying just go pick one and then your faith in that one God, whoever it happens to be, is going to be fine. No, Jesus is much more specific than that, and he assumes his audience understands that. And I think Matthew and Mark and all these authors understand exactly the same thing. It's unfortunate that BeDuhn didn't actually go look at those passages and provide an argument from them. But this means, of course, for BeDuhn that if the article is missing, then we need to translate it with an indefinite article in English. And that's how you can get this third clause in John 1:1 to actually say, and the Word was God. And he's very strict on this reasoning here, and I think this is deeply flawed. But not only that, again, this argument that God is a proper name if it's got the article, and a noun if it doesn't have the article, also pops up in this chapter as well. And since I've already talked about that a little bit, it's another one of these things. He just asserts it and then he moves on. He doesn't show any evidence to argue for why this is the case. And I think he needs that argument. He needs that evidence, because otherwise he's just making an assertion. In fact, Murray Harris argues that in the fourth gospel, there is no distinction between theos with the article and theos without the article. And I think, again, it's that kind of reasoning that BeDuhn really needs to talk about and take a look at before he makes these wild assertions. And in fact, if you really want a really good in-depth treatment of John 1:1 with regards to the article and the use of it, I really want to recommend to you Murray Harris's book, Jesus as God, which goes into quite a bit of depth on the use of the article in this verse. And Murray Harris's conclusion is, having distinguished that the Logos from the Father, which he does in the first two clauses here, John wished to point to their commonality, not merely in purpose, but in being. And so he's arguing here that theos, having no article here, is actually not qualitative. It's not to say he was the same as the God, as if the two could be interchanged. God and the Word are exactly the same being. He's saying here that the Word is the article and theos doesn't have the article, because what John is actually trying to say is that the Word has the very being of theos that's already been discussed in the second clause. And I think that's a much more compelling argument, particularly in the light of the amount of research and argumentation that Harris goes through in his book to look at that. And if you're interested in reading Harris's argument, I'll leave a link to Jesus as God in the description below, so you can go grab a copy of that from Amazon or Logos or wherever you feel so inclined to get it from. Now, one of the big things that's missing in this book, and I'll just say this in closing, is that, and I mentioned this at the beginning, is that he really just doesn't take into account that there is 1,700 years of discussion around the theological points of Jesus and his deity. And the problem with this whole book is it starts with the assumption that Jesus is not God, and then seeks to prove that by arguing that there is this bias toward Jesus as God in English translations. And I think, okay, perhaps. But I would argue that there's a reason for that bias, namely 1,700 years of theology, and there's probably a larger argument against those who would argue against it being biased than the other way around. And that's where I think this is flawed in a major way. He never really examines his own biases. He just assumes that the Greek supports his position and therefore puts the arguments out there. And I think if you hold to the same position that he holds to, then this may be persuasive. But if you know some Greek, I hope it won't be, because you will know as you read through this that his positions just don't really hold water. And so for that reason, I think this book does not do a good job of debunking the Granville-Sharp rule, or of establishing Jesus as just a divine being and there being lots of divine beings. I don't think it supports that very well at all. I don't think the exegesis is there to support that Jesus is just a small God rather than the Father who is a big God, which fundamentally is what you end up having to be with. And so I don't think this is a great book to argue from if you're a Jehovah's Witness or if you believe that Jesus is not God. My argument would be the scripture really argues quite well that Jesus is God, and he is, and there is this unity within the Godhead, and I think that's what we get as we sort of think through the text ourselves. So I'm interested in your thoughts though. If you read this book, if you consider these arguments, leave a comment in the comment section below. If you got this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. Leave me a brain emoji in the comment section. I look forward to seeing you there, and I'll click the love button on your comments there. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.